Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another top 5 deck lists for the month of November 2022 for the Pioneer format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative Pioneer videos, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. And don't forget to check out our sister channel for modern format, MTG Nexus. Alright, so taking a look at the top 5, I think it's kind of good to look at the format from a top-down perspective and kind of how the decks kind of relate to each other. And kind of undoubtedly the top-tier deck of the format is Rakdos Midrange. It is the deck that puts up the most results, has gotten the most tools recently, and just continues to kind of overrate the rest of the format. It's just aggressive enough to force the control and other mid-range decks to respect its game, as well as disrupting combo decks, and obviously has a very good matchup against the aggressive decks. Now, obviously, there can be challenges on both sides of the equation. There are decks that go over the top of it. Obviously, decks like Mono Green, which is number 2 on the list. Decks like Lotus Field, decks like 5-Color Niv, decks that can go under it or match it pound for pound. Decks like Abzan and Greasefang, forcing it to react on specific axes. Or decks like Humans that have the ability to grind if they're built in a particular way. So this deck is far from an unbeatable juggernaut, but is definitely the center point in the format, has the best disruption, has among the best creatures in the format, and just continues to get more and more powerful cards. Like this version that we're seeing here from Misplaced Ginger this past weekend, doesn't even play Lilliana the Veil. Obviously you also have cards, access to things like Chandra Torch of Defiance, Sorin. So many different options this deck has to choose from. Almost has an embarrassment of riches in terms of what it's doing. Some of the adjustments to the deck, obviously, kind of in addition to another deck that we'll talk about later on the list, with you're seeing a bunch of braids, but we'll talk about that in 1 second. The second deck, obviously, we can talk about is Mono Green, Devotion, Rainbow, whatever version it happens to be running. The two most popular versions generally right now are the Mono Green version and the version Splashing Teferi, who slows the sunset, as it makes the infinite combo much easier. Mono Green is the rare occurrence of a ramp deck that has a bunch of payoffs, a bunch of mid-range threats, and still having sufficient ramp to get where it's going. Traditionally, one of the bigger problems with ramp decks, obviously, is just they simply don't have enough payoffs, or there's a lot of air in this deck. This deck really doesn't suffer from that, as the most expensive card in the deck is Storm the Festival, and you can easily cast that just by hitting a few land drops and playing a Wolfwillow Haven or something and casting on turn 5, and overwhelming something like Rakdos. So Rakdos kind of protects Mono Green from the standpoint of it keeps aggressive decks from being too aggressive. They have to be more of a grindy kind of aggressive deck to be able to match Rakdos card for card. Kind of slows them down just a tiny bit and makes Mono Green's job a little bit easier, as obviously its toughest matchups are the hyper aggressive aggro decks in the format. Mono Green in turn kind of protects the Rakdos deck from a certain extent, as Karn obviously gives Mono Green access to a myriad of different options, helps to hold down decks like Lotus Field combo. In some regards holds Abzan in check, with Karn being able to shut down the vehicles, plus being able to torch the graveyard even game number 1. So overall, they're kind of a yin and yang situation in the format and do a very good job of protecting each other. And a lot of the decks that have kind of filled in around it, as far as the top echelon of the decks, are generally good against one, but kind of weak against the other. Another deck that is kind of up and down and all around is Izzet Arclight Phoenix. This is a deck that obviously is a transcendent deck, or a transfer deck from the modern format that used to be a powerful staple in that format, with things like Faithless Looting and stuff were legal. This deck does a little bit different than that deck does. Obviously, that deck doesn't have access to things like Treasure Cruise, Tremble Trespass, and didn't rely on things like Pieces of the Puzzle. It was more of a cantrip, get your thing into the graveyard, kill you as quickly as possible, or flip a quick thing in the ice. Thing in the Ice has kind of fallen by the wayside, as it's just answered a whole lot easier than it used to be, and the one matchup you really want it in, generally speaking, is against, obviously, the creature decks, and a deck like Mono Green, it can be very good. Otherwise, Ledger Shredder plays to your strategy much better, and Arclight Phoenix is obviously kind of the centerpiece of the deck. Beyond that, this deck tends to be very good against the aggressive decks, having a bunch of early red removal, as well as access to sweepers out of the sideboard, and tends to struggle against decks that go over the top of it. So things like Lotus Field combo, those kind of decks can kind of give it fits. And a lot of its game plan is predicated on Graveyard Hate, which kind of dovetails with another deck in the top 5, as that rises, that makes Phoenix's job a little bit more difficult. But this is still a deck that can have a decent plan B, and does get to play a bunch of counter spells that can shore up a lot of different matchups. Where it struggles overall is it struggles into the Rakdos matchup. It has a lot of good tools, but Rakdos can kind of take away your graveyard, especially if they're playing ley lines on the sideboard, which they're already kind of bringing in to target Greasefang anyway. Makes your life a lot more difficult, and this is a deck that kind of rises and falls as Rakdos is geared towards it or not. And also, weird combo decks popping up can sometimes be a fit if it doesn't revolve around creatures. So decks like Lotus Field can definitely be a rough matchup for Izzet Phoenix. One of the few aggressive decks that can slide into this kind of yin-yang format is Mono White Humans, and that's simply because it has aggression, disruption, and grindiness. Obviously, it has access to things like Wedding Announcement, Extraction Specialist, etc., which kind of gives it a grindy plan B against things like Rakdos, while also having a bunch of 1-drops, playing some powerful 2-drops like Thalia and Thalia's Lieutenant with either pump your team or disrupt your opponent, and then Adeline is kind of the KO of the deck. The biggest power of the deck, obviously, is in Brave the Elements, just being able to punch through a big board state of something like Mono Green, while also protecting your creatures from, say, Red Sweepers or a bunch of removal from Rakdos on a key turn. Really gives this deck a lot of play, and for an aggressive deck, it really has quite a bit of options available to it, as obviously White traditionally has very good utility in what it does. Once again, it does kind of struggle into Rakdos. I've had a lot of people tell me that it's an even matchup from the human side. I still find that hard to believe that, the matchup is completely even, but I do think Rakdos can be a close-ish matchup if the deck is built right, but obviously, the more grinding cards you're putting into your deck or sideboard, the less you have for Mono Green. So, once again, you're kind of caught in the squeeze of the top 2 decks in the format. I think the other deck that is firmly cemented itself as a top 5 contender right now is Greasefang. Now, there's obviously a couple different variants of Greasefang. There's kind of the more traditional version, what's running a bunch of, Can't Stay Away, as Grizzly Salvages, all these different things that you're still seeing in this list, without running a card like Eldritch Evolution. But Eldritch Evolution kind of gives you this turbo ability to find Greasefang as long as you have like a Cedar Wayfinder or Rafine. Or a Citrus Supplier makes it a lot easier to find half the combo. And then you're just trying to find one of your big payoffs here. Now, obviously, you're not playing a decent plan B with things like Lilliana and such, so you're a little bit more vulnerable to what your opponent's doing. And then, obviously, you have access to like the more mid-rangey version with Lilliana or whatnot. Just comes down to, do you want to play a more get 'em dead kind of game, which is better against things like Mono Green, because you really need to have a Parhelion on 3 if possible against Mono Green before they can get a Karn down and shut you down. Or do you want to have kind of a more grindy, resilient plan, which is more better into a field with like blue-white control, or is it Phoenix or Rakdos? Gives you this much better game plan when they're able to shut down your primary, get Greasefang, and burr pretty much. Aggressive decks obviously can be a bit of a problem, especially if they're like mono red or mono white, and they can hold up removal on a key turn and still pressure you in the meantime. That's why the mid-range plan is so important in some of these builds, and you'll see the different variants with like Lilliana or Eldritch Evolution, just kind of depending on what you want to do. Sometimes go fast is good, sometimes grindy is good, just kind of depends on your preference of playstyle. This is definitely my preferred deck of the top tier decks as far as what I play in the Explorer format. And obviously Explorer is just a little bit different than full-blown Pioneer, but still a lot of the same powerful things, with the exception of Mono Green really not having Nykthos and Lotus Field not really being a thing. But a lot of the other top tier decks have most of their powerful pieces in play. Finally, you have a mid-range deck in Gruel Vehicles that has kind of become the talk of the format the last couple weeks, other than Aspiring Spike messing with Tybalt's Trickery combo nonsense, which really isn't a consistent deck and not something I would consider a top tier deck, but can just kind of randomly get people because it's a turn 2 combo deck. But this deck is designed mainly to fight the 2 big decks. It's designed to go head to head with Rakdos with the use of Asika's Chariot and Sky Sovereign, which Sky Sovereign is probably the single best card against Rakdos overall. And then using things like the Akroan War and other things to steal your opponent's big dumb creatures, and then try to get them dead as quickly as possible. This deck does not quite have the raw speed of something like Gruel Bushwhacker combo, but has a much better mid-range game plan against kind of the utility of the format. Whether you're playing against decks like Izzet Phoenix, whether you're playing against decks like Mono Green or Rakdos, this deck tends to have a fairly reasonable matchup against all of those. That said, it's just a pile of good cards and really doesn't have a ton of interaction for things like a Lotus Field combo, or decks can go over the top of it potentially with something like 5-color Nib, just kind of ignoring a lot of what this deck is doing. Overall, I think the deck is in a decent place, but it had a huge debut weekend and then kind of dropped off last weekend, so it kind of remains to be seen if this has the staying power to become a top tier deck, or if this is something like Chunky Red that just pops up every now and again and is a solid mid-range deck that can compete with the big boys but has some other weaknesses that it can't always address. That said, there's still a lot of iterating on this deck. We've kind of done a video that was released earlier this week. There's really a couple different variants of the deck. You have this kind of more traditional version that we're looking at, and then there's this kind of combo-esque version with Combat Celebrant and Fabled and Mirror Breaker, kind of allowing you to go infinite turns and kind of kill your opponent, but it's a little less resilient against something like Rakdos Midrange. So those are the kind of top 5 decks in the Pioneer format currently, and I do apologize for all the sneezing and everything else going on in this video. Just trying to get through this video to get the Thursday video out with fighting a rather nasty nasal infection and such right now. So hopefully it wasn't too bad for you guys. And once again, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Don't forget to check out our sister channel, MTG Nexus. And hope to see you for the next video next Monday, which should be another deck guide.